Yeah, it's an honour and a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to talk about one of my favourite topics. I'm going to talk for probably up to an hour or so. We leave time for questions, because I'm sure there's lots that people will want to ask about. But if anyone wants to raise any points of clarification while I'm talking, please feel free to do so, because I'm very much aware that this is a topic that I've become very much embedded in, and it's complicated, and there's a tangled history, and some of you may want a little bit of clarification on some of the points. So just a little bit about myself. I work at King's College London, and one of my main interests, both in teaching and research, is vocational education and training, or VET for short. We always call it VET or VET, so if I use that phrase, that's what it means. Otherwise it's a bit of a mouthful. And I've done a lot of work on British vocational education. I've done a lot of work comparing other European countries' systems of VET with ours and looking at some of the similarities and differences. And I've been involved in projects on such occupations as bricklaying, other construction occupations, furniture making, scaffolding, looking at the similarities and differences between the ways in which things are done here in the UK and the ways in which they're done in other countries. And there's some very interesting contrasts, for example, with the Germanophone countries and England. I might talk a little bit about. Anyway, there's the title, Britain's Failure to Train Its Workforce. It's a title, actually, that was used as long ago as 1978 by two economists who first looked into this question in detail. And the fact that it's still relevant, perhaps, tells you quite a bit about how we've struggled with VET in the UK over the years. So there's my subtitle, Vocational Education, Labour Markets and the Challenge of Economic Renewal. And as you would probably have known just from listening to the media and reading papers, people talk about Britain's productivity problems, and they talk about our failure to develop a skilled workforce. So the talk is located in that area, and I'll give some of my own personal views as well as some of the history as well, because I do have a view on these issues. So just to make a start then, an overview of our talk. Thanks a lot, that's great. It's generally agreed that a skilled workforce is key to productivity growth. Might not be the only thing, but it's a central component. With some exceptions, Britain runs what's called a low-skill equilibrium. That's rather a mouthful, but what it means in essence is we've got an economy that runs in large part on products of relatively low specification made by low-paid workers who themselves can only afford relatively cheap goods. Okay, so it's a kind of a vicious circle. And the consensus has been for many years that Britain needs to transition to what's called a high-skill equilibrium, where high-spec products are made by highly paid workers who in their turn can buy expensive high-spec products. And the key to this is to ensure that employers up their game in their business strategies, which is not as easy as it might sound for reasons that we probably go into as we go along. We need to ensure then that we have a skilled workforce to meet ambitious business strategies. And my final point is that the early signs that we have from the Labour government are not terribly encouraging, sad to say. But then that follows a familiar historical pattern in Britain, I'm afraid. So let's have a look at some of the problems that the British society and the British economy has got to wrestle with. Let's have a look at the British labour market. It's characterised by a lot of poor job security and weak workers' rights. We're all aware of the increasing casualisation of the workforce in the so-called gig economy, and there are many poorly regulated workplaces with a large grey economy where labour laws are not well enforced. There's been decades-long remarked on reluctance on the part of employers to train the workforce. That's something I'll come into when we get into the more historical parts of this talk. But that's a central problem and continues to be one. And I should also mention that some of the problems in accessing skilled and essential workers are solved by using migrant labour as a substitute for upskilling. And there are some significant areas of skill shortage, often met by importing skilled labour from countries that very often can ill afford to lose them, i.e. in the health service. So, I want to give you a quote now from a gentleman you've probably heard of, Adam Smith, writing in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. And this Smith has been very influential in British attitudes towards skilled work, because those of you who are familiar with The Wealth of Nations will remember that he uses an example of making pins right at the outset of The Wealth of Nations. He points out that pins can be made by one person carrying out roughly 12 operations, but you can equally easily break those 12 operations down and assign one to each person who doesn't need any particular expertise to carry out that operation, and you have what has been called the division of labour, but is more accurately called fragmentation of the labour process. So Smith was an advocate of this. He was hostile to vocational education in Europe. He thought that apprenticeships and guilds, essentially medieval institutions that had survived into the 18th century, were a way of interfering with the way in which the labour market worked. And there's a whole chapter in The Wealth of Nations called The Policy of Europe, where he rails against the institution of apprenticeship. So he had a key role, I would say, in some of the problems that we face in the current time. As Smith's views became very influential quite early on after the publication of The Wealth of Nations. And I love this quote. He's writing here about bricklayers. No species of skilled labour, however, seems more easy to learn than that of masons and bricklayers. Chairman in London, I should say here, he's not talking about chairman of the board, but the guys who carry sedan chairs around. Chairman in London, during the summer season, are said sometimes to be employed as bricklayers. The high wages of those workmen, therefore, are not so much the recompense of their skill as the compensation for the inconstancy of their employment. So he clearly doesn't have a very high opinion of the expertise needed to be a bricklayer. And if we look at some of the buildings around here, and others like the George Gilbert Scott buildings in London, like St Pancras Station, we may wonder that they would just take very little training to execute. But anyway, very influential view, and one greatly to our detriment, I think. So, what should the role of vocational education be? I just want to make a few key points about this. First of all, VET is not a substitute for good jobs. There's got to be a relationship between supply of jobs and the demand for VET. If there is a dearth of good jobs requiring skills, you won't be surprised to see that among young people and people looking for jobs, there will be a relative lack of enthusiasm in investing time and effort in vocational education. So the supply-demand relationship is really important. Good VET gives access to good jobs, by which I mean well-paid, worthwhile, interesting work that gives a degree of autonomy, that is to say, scope for your own agency in the workplace. But you also need VET to make good jobs possible. Expertise doesn't grow out of nowhere. So VET and job creation need to be coordinated with each other. And one of the things I want to say is that there's been little consistency in the provision of VET in England. Well, we could go right back to the beginning of the 19th century, but I'm not going to do that. I'm instead going to start in 1964, the accession of Harold Wilson as Prime Minister at that time. And I've chosen 1964 because it's the high watermark of what is sometimes called corporatism, or to put it another way, the large interest groups in society, the employers, the trade unions, and the state working together collectively to solve problems. This didn't start with Harold Wilson's government. I think you can trace back this kind of institutionalized cooperation right back to the end of the Second World War, even through the successive Conservative administrations in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in fact, the Industrial Training Act of 1964 had already been drafted by the outgoing Macmillan government and was essentially taken over by the incoming Labour government, because they both had at that time a fairly settled view on the way in which industrial issues should be sorted out, roughly speaking, with the trade unions being centrally involved along with employers. As you know now, that landscape has completely changed, but that was the conventional wisdom of the day. So the Industrial Training Act of 1964, I'll talk about in a moment, had very limited success, and that approach gradually died away, and the dying away accelerated under the Thatcher governments, and we got a shift in power and influence away from these kinds of collective arrangements to employer-led qualifications, the so-called National Vocational Qualifications, or NVQs, which were inaugurated around about 1986. The Labour governments from 1997 onwards didn't essentially make any change to that. They took the view that if you supply enough vocational education, employers will demand it. So it was, as economists might call it, a supply-side solution to the problem of Britain's failure to train. Interestingly enough, the incoming Conservatives from that 2010 onwards took a rather, what you might consider, given their Thatcherite heritage, a rather unexpected turn. They became very critical of these NVQs, which were considered to be low quality qualifications. They introduced a compulsory levy on larger employers, which they could only recoup through training their workforce. And the Wolf report of 2011 was highly critical of these poor quality qualifications. So-called outcomes-based approaches were gradually sidelined, and new qualifications like the T levels, the technical levels, roughly equivalent to A levels, and other restructuring of qualifications, including making apprenticeships more rigorous, all came in during this period. I wouldn't say that the Conservatives' efforts, although they were serious and concerted, were successful. The levy has been a big disappointment. The T levels have run into all sorts of problems, and you can make complaints about the new kind of apprenticeships that the Conservatives introduced. But having said all that, there was at least an attempt to look at the problem from the point of view of, is there sufficient demand for expertise in the workforce, as opposed to the previous view, which was, if we supply enough people with qualifications, then the employers will come. So there was a change in orientation. And as I said at the outset, by the return of the Starmer government in 2024, we're already beginning to see the signs of retreat from some of these Conservative reforms. So, and this is my personal view, the outlook at the moment isn't great. Right, so let's turn to the Industrial Training Act of 1964 in a bit more detail. I would characterise it as a response to working class power, that is to say the strength of the trade unions after the Second World War, under the leadership of very influential figures like Ernest Bevin and later Jack Jones, a response to working class power and an attempt to strengthen the British economy through improving the know-how of the workforce. As I said, the legislation was drafted under the Tories, but the incoming Labour government put it into legislation. And the essence of it was that economic sectors would introduce a levy, that is a compulsory tax on employers if the sector wanted it, which would then serve to finance apprenticeships. And for it to work, you needed both trade unions and businesses to agree that their sector needed to have apprenticeship introduced or expanded. But as the 60s wore on into the 1970s, it became clear that training levies never really expanded far beyond areas where apprenticeship was already well established. For example, in the electrical trades, in engineering and construction. And the only legacy from that period is there is one sectoral body left, Construction Industry Training Board, the only one that survives from that era, and even that is a shadow of what it was intended to be in the 1960s. And part of the trouble was that there was limited enthusiasm on the part of employers, certainly, but the trade union movement was not especially supportive either. And I think it's fair to say that without the support of trade unions, you are not going to get much progress in this kind of collective approach to VET. So this is still, I would say, a major issue for us. Another term for this kind of cooperation between employers and employees is a term that's very much used in Europe. We're a bit less familiar with it. It's called social partnership, and the idea is that collective action problems are solved by these large interest groups in the society, particularly the employers, the trade unions, coordinated by the state. So the Industrial Training Act was never really recognised by the trade union movement as an important gain for the working class. From the early 1970s, its provisions started to be eroded, particularly in the small and medium enterprise sector. The incoming Conservative government of 1979 was absolutely hostile to working class power generally and to corporate structures in particular. However, some of you may remember that this was a period when high youth unemployment really hit British society in a way it hadn't before since the Second World War, and it was impossible really for the state not to intervene here. So there was some limitation on the purported attacks on training that occurred because of this very high youth unemployment. If you remember, some of you may remember the youth training scheme, for example, in the 1980s, was in large part a response to this problem. However, by 1986, it became possible to introduce so-called employer-led qualifications, the ones I've already mentioned, the national vocational qualifications, which were intended to undermine actually existing VET provision and introduce a radically new way of looking at vocational education. And I'm going to say a few words about that, and I'm going to put my personal interpretation on it, which maybe not everyone will agree with. And I called it, because its acolytes did see themselves as revolutionaries, the NVQ revolution. And you could look at it as a massive attempt at the de-skilling of the working class and dismantling of the already existing training system. In fairness to the civil servants who were involved in its construction, that was not how they saw it. But the realities of power determined that this is how it would develop. So what do I mean by that? Well, the NVQ was a qualification awarded on the basis of one's ability to perform a set of tasks in the workplace. So if, under reasonably realistic conditions, an assessor determines that you could carry out the functions, let us say, of a waiter or a construction worker, a bricklayer, then you were deemed eligible for the award of a certificate. Level 2 or level 3 in practice, most of them were level 2 semi-skilled ones. So the idea was that you wouldn't need to have to go to an FE college or undertake an apprenticeship. It would be sufficient to attain the qualification that you demonstrated competence in the workplace. Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a very attractive idea. It's only later that some of the problems began to emerge. The trade union movement, again, failed to see the dangers, the potential dangers of undermining the qualification structure and institutions like apprenticeship that existed at that time. The NVQs, and I've used the word competence advisedly here, NVQs were based on bundles of narrowly defined tasks. So if you take an occupation like bricklaying, you could break it down in Adam Smith style into smaller components. And if the candidate for an NVQ could carry out each of those component tasks, they were deemed competent to be a bricklayer. That's the underlying thought there. Just one observation on that. It's sometimes known, thinking that you can get the whole from just putting together all the parts, is sometimes known as the fallacy of composition. It doesn't follow from the fact you've got all the parts and put them together that you have a coherent whole. One analogy one could use would be if you have 11 outstanding footballers. They're each individually talented, skilled people. Putting them all together doesn't necessarily turn them into an outstanding football team. Okay, because they don't necessarily understand their roles and they can't work together and they don't have a common purpose. You need those things as well. And likewise, for occupations, you could argue that an occupation needs an underlying purpose. You need to state the purpose and then ask yourself, what is it that's needed for someone to be competent in this occupation? The NVQ put things the other way around. So they were based on bundles of narrowly defined tasks. They could be awarded on current performance, not on enhanced know-how. It rapidly emerged that they had very weak currency in the labour market. There are even figures to suggest that someone with an NVQ sometimes earned less than someone without one, which is hardly a ringing endorsement for it as a qualification. And they promoted what I described earlier on as a low-skill equilibrium. They were certificates of having a relatively low level of skill. So the supply to the employer was not such as to inform a business strategy that depended on highly skilled work. So that was the NVQ revolution. And I think it's fair to say that this proved NVQs were a dominant form of vocational qualification for some 30 years, right through the Conservative governments of the 1990s and the Blair-Brown governments of the early 2000s. And to some extent, this NVQ revolution was even enhanced, was even intensified by the Blair-Brown government, who essentially, despite the rhetoric about upskilling Britain and the knowledge economy, failed to do anything significant about upskilling the British workforce. Both Blair and Brown were believers in the supply side myth. That is to say, if the quantity of qualifications were increased, then the demand for skill would similarly rise. But as I pointed out, NVQ qualifications were of little value and were perceived to be such. So these years mark an intensification of the employer retreat from involvement in training. If you look at the amount of money employers invest in training, it continues to decline over this period. You might have qualifications serving as a recruitment, so as a filter, but the underlying skill base did not improve and may even have deteriorated during this period. And again, there was little dissent what dissent was ignored. There were people in the academic world who raised these problems, but I think Gordon Brown was notorious for not liking to have bad news brought to him. So people of this kind were effectively shut out of the discussion. And there was little dissent either within the Labour Party or within the trade union movement. And Labour policy was much more focused on the financial sector than it was on manufacturing and some of the other high-tech sectors. So in my view, and again I'm stressing this is my view, we had some significant harms arising from the Blair-Brown years. I call it a dismal period, and I think Gordon Brown must pick up much of the responsibility for this. In particular, he seized on the term apprenticeship. I should say, perhaps I ought to say a few words about apprenticeship. It's too easy for me to assume that everyone understands the same thing. By apprenticeship, I mean the form of vocational education where someone, usually a young person, not necessarily, but usually a young person, is taken on as a junior employee. They have an employee's contract, but unlike a fully mature worker, the contract involves undertaking some learning as well as working. And the traditional model is that you need something like 3 years to go from the point where you're doing a lot of learning and not much productive work to the point where you're doing more than earning your keep. You are on the verge of becoming a skilled worker. So the employer's investment, if you like, is front-loaded, and they start to recoup it towards the end of the apprenticeship. So that's the traditional form of apprenticeship. And traditionally they've been very long, around about 7 years or so. In European countries, to take Germany as an example, an apprenticeship is a 3-year to 3.5-year program. And again, it reflects the economic payoff for the employer of getting a skilled worker at the end of 3 years. But what happens in Britain at this point was that Brown realised that the term apprenticeship had very good resonance with the public. It suggested something traditional, wholesome, of good value, and he and his colleagues started to use the term to include low-level training and adult retraining. And of course, not surprisingly, the apprenticeship figures seemed to shoot up because you were including all kinds of people as apprentices who would not have been considered apprentices before. But of course, that didn't make the quality of what was being offered any better than it was before. And just to give you a sense of this, a level 3 apprenticeship, which is the standard for a skilled worker, in a country like Germany, which does rely very heavily on apprenticeship, if you're taking young people between the ages of, say, 16 and 25, something not much under 50% of young people go through an apprenticeship in Germany. In Britain, in England rather, it's more like 3%. So there's a huge disparity. Even if we expanded apprenticeship enormously in Britain, we'd rely on our further education colleges to take up the bulk of the work of vocational education. But this was all smoke and mirrors, what I'm talking about here. And the NVQ continued to be promoted. NVQs were awarded for so-called apprenticeships, and qualifications were confused with know-how. Because these qualifications had little value, the know-how that stood behind them was very often of little value. And to make matters even worse, in 2005, the government ordered the awarding bodies like City and Guilds and BTEC and so on to rewrite all their qualifications on this outcomes-based model similar to the NVQ, thus compromising their integrity. And this is a problem that we're still wrestling with. And to make matters worse still, in the closing years of the Labour government, apprenticeships were further degraded through a weak and permissive framework which allowed somebody to become a certified apprentice with as little as 6 months training and the award of a level 2 NVQ. So it became apprenticeship became a brand, if you like, that had lost a lot of its value at that point. Now, you would expect, probably, that the Conservatives would have continued this trend, but that was not actually the case. The Conservative Party had a number of influential people who they actually listened to. Perhaps one of the most influential is someone called Alison Wolfe, now Baroness Dulwich, who persuaded the Conservatives that what had been inherited from the Labour government of this period was something of a mess. It had allowed our qualification system to deteriorate and hadn't addressed the issue of employer reluctance to invest in VET. So the Tories, through the influence of people like Alison Wolfe, recognised the employer retreat. And I should say, because Alison Wolfe herself was not regarded as a left-wing critic, she was regarded as someone politically close to the Conservatives, and that helped her to be listened to, even though her critique actually had a lot in common with a lot of academics who had otherwise been ignored, I have to say. So the Conservatives recognised the employer retreat from training and made concerted efforts to do something about it. The training levy was introduced to stimulate employer demand by imposing a cost that could only be recouped by training employees. It was poorly designed, however. There are too many loopholes and too many ways of gaming it. I can talk about that in more detail if people are interested. But it's been a big disappointment so far. If employers feel they will lose employees they have invested in, they will not train. They will only feel safe and obliged in a national occupational labour market. And that only comes about when enough businesses consider that it's a sound business strategy to invest in high skills. Otherwise, the danger is for something like a levy, it's a cost to be written off, or it's to be gamed in some way or other. For example, by retraining existing employees, which you can do under the levy, which wasn't its intention. So the issue about having a highly skilled workforce as an essential component of their business strategy was not addressed. So it was a flawed series of reforms. I don't think the blame can be laid at the door of Alison Wolfe, because she was acutely aware of all these problems, but somehow within the implementation of government policy, the original idea got diluted through other priorities, through poor design as well as a factor, I think. But there was an attempt to dismantle the Thatcher-Brown legacy. As I say, the Tories were serious about this. I've mentioned the Wolfe report. There were other reports that followed recommending improved apprenticeships, the Richard Review. There was another one, the Whitehead Review, which recommended improved qualification design. And then there was another one called the Sainsbury Review, which advocated high-level technical qualifications, sectorally based. And that was the origin of what we now call T-levels. And the terrible framework apprenticeships of the Blair-Brown period were replaced by standards apprenticeships, which were an improvement on the Brown era, because they signified a decisive move away from this NVQ philosophy that had been dominant for 30 years. If you go on the website, the IFATE website, and look up apprenticeships, what you will see is that there is a small statement of what the occupation is about. So you do have this idea of an occupational aim. A bricklayer is someone who does such and such. You know, you have a definition of an occupational competence. And then the particular skills that are needed are broken down from there. So you're starting at the right place. What is the occupational profile? What do you need to be competent in this occupation? So it was a big change in design philosophy. And then, as a further attempt to consolidate better vocational qualifications, the T levels were introduced. And although it's still relatively early days, it is unfortunately true that the T level innovation has itself run into some serious difficulties, not the least of which has been guaranteeing the 45-day work experience that all people taking a T level need to do. That's proved extremely difficult to put into practice, particularly in areas which rely on small businesses like the digital sector. They simply don't have the capacity. The very ambitious aim of having this extensive work experience was not sufficiently thought through, unfortunately. And there are other problems with T levels. Perhaps in discussion we can go into those, but I don't want to dwell too much on it just at the moment. So what we are seeing now is what I would describe as something of a retreat from the ambition that we saw during this previous period. The Conservatives did one very controversial thing. Since they were very eager to make the T levels a mass qualification, they decided to defund nearly all non-T level qualifications, i.e. the bulk of qualifications that young people were taking at this time. And that brought about a lot of fear, because the T levels, unlike the City and Guilds and the BTEC qualifications that they were intended to replace, do have quite a high emphasis on competence in English and maths. And as we know, there are a lot of young people who unfortunately cannot reach a high enough standard in English and maths to meet the demands of these qualifications. And although some palliative measures were put into place, the fact that you had such a high threshold meant that currently a lot of young people can't access these qualifications. And if at the same time you defund the existing qualifications for all their faults, which I've already talked about, you leave a huge number of young people not going to university, not capable of accessing a T level without any meaningful qualifications. So that was, they really went out on a ledge there, and they've had to row back on that. So the alternative qualifications, which as I say are deeply flawed, have had to be retained because there are no alternatives, and too few young people can access T levels. And now we have seen once again the degrading of the term apprenticeship by the government introducing shorter 8-month apprenticeship and ditching the maths and English requirements, which I think is a mistake. And again, that's something we can talk about later. But you can see what's happening here. We're seeing already in the opening months of the new government, we can see some significant retreat from some of the reforms that the Conservatives had put into place at an earlier stage. And just to put things in perspective here, we're looking at trends in apprenticeship over the years. And as I said earlier, we're starting from a very small base. You can see the numbers shoot up from around about 2,500. But that, as I say, is largely smoke and mirrors, because Gordon Brown rebadged all kinds of things as apprenticeship. So this great surge in apprenticeship should not be taken as a surge in the skilling of the British workforce. And you can see it starts to dip again from 2017 onwards. And if we look at this chart, we can see how, ironically enough, from the period when the apprenticeship levy is introduced, you see the numbers, they decline and then they plateau. Now, some of that is down to the fact that the low quality apprenticeships of the late Labour era were dispensed with. But the fact remains that there hasn't been any large-scale revival in the take-up of apprenticeship since the introduction of the levy, and we conclude that as it's currently configured, it hasn't been a success. It's not to say it never will be. It's not to say that standards-based apprenticeships weren't a great improvement on what went before. But sadly, we can see that the take-up of apprenticeship has not occurred. So let's take a further look at the UK. We have some great industries with a highly skilled workforce. There are areas of the British economy which are a high-skilled equilibrium. Too much of it, though, is stuck in the so-called low-skill equilibrium, which we already talked about. So the aspiration is to get to a situation where the norm is that highly skilled, qualified and paid workers produce relatively expensive but high spec and high quality products. And at one point, I think the Tories actually saw this, they realised that this was the way to go. And they were interested in going down this road and did make concerted efforts, but ultimately their attempt was not successful. And I'm not saying for a moment that it's easy to make that kind of transition, because I don't think it is. But unfortunately, their attempt was not to be judged a success. So what I'm going to do now, and I'm aware of it, I've been talking rather too much really per slide. I'm going to just give you some idea of some of the problems. I called it some striking numbers. As I said, our FE colleges do the bulk of our vocational education. In 22-23, their income was 6.9 billion a year. Sounds like a lot, but look down at the number of students in the FE sector. In that period, 2.7 million. In England, all institutions of higher education had a total income of 44 billion pounds. Look at the number of students in higher education, 2.9 million, very similar to the FE sector. This means that universities get around 44 billion a year in income, over 6 times that of FE colleges, and I should say that half a billion of the FE college income is for higher education work that goes on in that sector. So you can also see that the austerity from 2010, again, this is bungled policy making, I would say. You're trying to revive vocational education, but instead the FE sector lost about £1 billion between 2010 and 2019, representing a cumulative cut in income of around 12% for FE colleges. The Labour government has made some attempts to put money back into the system. I think 300 million is the figure mentioned, but it's not going to redress the decline, let alone introduce any kind of equity between the HE and FE sectors. And again, look at the salaries. Top salary for a mainstream FE lecturer, £42,000 a year. For a university lecturer, it's more like 47. And bear in mind here that the FE sector is recruiting, or aspires to recruit, successful people working in industry. And very often they are people who are going to be on good salaries, and they're being asked to take a pay cut, essentially, and retrain as teachers. So the incentive structure for recruiting into the FE sector sadly isn't there at the moment. Let alone the challenge of how do you rebalance that large income for higher education to make it more equitable with the income for further education, bearing in mind that the university sector itself is struggling a great deal with inadequate financial resources. So you've got some real tough problems on your plate here. So what should we be aiming for here? We want young people to be able to stay in their communities if they wish to. Flourishing communities attract investment and retain their young people. So we want to avoid a situation where work is concentrated in a few parts of the country. It needs to be distributed around the country, and this requires the state acting in cooperation with local authorities, including investment from the state. We should ultimately aim for an occupational labour market where vocational qualifications allow people freedom to move for work. In Germany, for example, if an employer invests 3 years training in an apprentice, and that apprentice decides to move on, maybe for personal reasons, that might be unfortunate, but it's not disastrous because there is already a pool of similarly qualified people in the labour market. It's not going to be a catastrophe. So you need something like an occupational labour market to make this work. That means having a critical mass of qualified people and a critical mass of jobs for them to go to. So we need to strike a balance between gearing VET to local needs but providing opportunities for mobility if people want them. And I should add here that very often the aspiration to stay in your own community is compromised not just by the lack of jobs, but very often by such factors as the ability to get to a job or an apprenticeship that you might want to do. I don't know how acute the problem is in Birmingham and the West Mids, where I suspect their transport links are relatively good compared with other parts of the country, but in some parts of the country it's a real problem. A young person might aspire to an apprenticeship in a town not that far away, but if the travel time is a couple of hours and the fares are high, they're just not going to be able to take up that opportunity. So this is why investment in the local environment, not just in the VET opportunities, is really important. And young people very often can't stay and work in their local area because of quite simple barriers like this. So, what we have here is a situation of long-term reluctance to invest in VET. And many, for perfectly sound business reasons, prefer low-skill, low-productivity work as a business strategy. And migrant labour, as I pointed out earlier on, very often provides them with a training-free lunch. In other words, they get people with the requisite minimal training without having to invest themselves, or even when it's more demanding work in terms of skills, there's very often a ready pool of labour from overseas to provide that, which reduces the incentive to invest in VET in the UK. And there's also an unfortunate feedback effect from the labour market to educational aspiration, which I summed up as, why should I work at school if I don't need academic qualifications for the job I'm likely to get? Now you might call that a poor attitude, well, maybe, but very often for a lot of young people that's the reality of the way in which they think about things, and we're not providing them sufficient incentive to get the English and maths, for example, to do the T-level or whatever. So, is there a different way of doing things? Well, let's have a look at what's been tried and how successful it's been. We've tried increasing the supply of qualifications through the NVQ and similar reforms, but this doesn't increase employer demand. And why would it, unless employers can see their way to having a successful strategy using highly skilled labour? Simply having a supply of qualified people around isn't going to incentivise them sufficiently. And in fact, these qualifications, as I pointed out, are too often poor quality, low labour market value. The employment levy has not, as I pointed out, succeeded in increasing apprenticeships, and won't so long as training does not align with business strategy. There continues to be a lack of work experience opportunities for young people. That's a problem not just when you're doing a qualification, but too few young people get the opportunity to experience the world of work and understand how it differs from being someone at school, a dependent at school, somebody who's entering the adult world with all the responsibilities that entail. And I've already mentioned lack of transport being a major problem for young people. In a project I was involved in, one of the areas we looked at was a rural area, the Cotswolds, and I looked at some of the bus timetables. So if you wanted to get from North Leach at the northern end of the Cotswolds down to the FE College at Cirencester, you were looking at a journey of something like 2 hours, if not more. This is the kind of problem that there is in too many parts of the country. So, there are things that can be done. There needs to be better supervision of informal and illegal labour markets for increased scrutiny and enforcement of existing regulations. And that incidentally is a problem with standards apprenticeships, because although they look good on paper, too often their provisions are not actually satisfied by employers. We need to make sure the levy is used to provide proper apprenticeships, not just short-term training. Well, as I've seen, we're seeing a retreat on that front now. And I've also mentioned the difficulties of mobilising resources. I can say a bit about that in the discussion. But we also need investment in housing, amenities, education and transport, because you're not going to attract investment from outside unless you provide an attractive environment for businesses to invest in. So VET cannot be considered in isolation as an investment. It needs to be considered in conjunction with the other attributes that a neighbourhood, community, a region has. Right. Looking to the longer term, and I'm going to wrap up now, and I hope there's time for discussion. We do need to shift investment away from higher to further education and ensure that colleges serve local needs in a coordinated way. We need to ensure that everyone has access to good qualifications that are nationally recognised. We need to gradually increase the number of occupations requiring a licence to practice while ensuring job security and training opportunities for older workers. We need to invest in primary education so that everyone leaves primary school with good achievements in English and maths, because the fact of the matter is that if you don't reach your expected level by the time you leave primary school, the chances of you reaching it later in secondary school are actually quite slim, even with repeated retakes of GCSEs. So it's really important to get this right at the outset. And as I say, trade unions have an important role to play in negotiating for improved VET opportunities, and I don't think that they've been doing all that they might do in that respect. So, just to conclude, I'm going to just pose a few questions. First, how can we ensure there's a good offer for those young people who do not wish to or are unable to go to university? That is to say, roughly 50% of our school leavers. I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest they get a very poor deal indeed compared with young people who intend to go to university. I can say a lot more about that. How can we help young people to stay in the communities in which they were brought up, if that is what they wish? And last but certainly not least, how can we make employers up their game so that they provide better jobs and worthwhile occupations? And I'm sure you will have a lot of points and questions to ask, so I'll leave it at that point, and perhaps we can open up for discussion. Thank you. The gentleman
I've got a couple of points to make. The first one is, I'm afraid I disagree with you on one point. That thing about industries to move to job rather than jobs to industries. The Attlee government passed the Location of Industries Act, one of the first things it did in October 1945, enabling the government to choose where industries located, and resulted in some disastrous decisions were made. Because companies who want to open in the south or the Midlands or the home counties were forced to open in the former depressed areas of Wales, Scotland and the north of England. Now, the chickens, they got away with it first because Europe was in ruins, continental Europe, but become the German economic miracle, the French economic miracle, the Italian economic miracle, the Spanish economic miracle, the Pan Revival, so did South Korea. And the result is, many of those companies, and there's come a soaring fuel costs in the 1970s, and the chickens come home to roost. Because, like the Backgate car plant, companies that want, I think the car industry want to Birmingham lost over 600 in major industrial projects through that policy. They include, now some are mutually exclusive, but the result was the factory in the Backgate car plant is now closed because it was in the raw materials that have been trucked hundreds of miles to be there processing, and in return, there was my view that involved in a change in the 1920s and 30s, knew enough when industry revived in the late 1930s, but it should go where the industries wanted. There had to be some provision at that time for the fact the war was coming. So I think the need is, I think the company should be going to create areas that, long hard work used to say, there should be areas where, which are flourishing, more or less fully employment, where need to invest in infrastructure and also in and also in housing as well, so that people can move down there. Areas which are beyond help, which should be gradually evacuated and sometimes return to rural areas. I mean, some of the areas which are only industrialised because of coal mining. I mean, I've seen on Portillo one mining village in North East, which is now Fieldsby and agriculture. And the third one is the industry area like the Midlands, we could do with some help. But I don't think it should be up to the government to tell where industry to go. The governments are all the politicians. It's where industry to go, where the facility now naturally employers will take account of the job market.
I wasn't suggesting that the state should direct industries to where they should go, and I certainly wouldn't defend all the acts of the government. All I'm suggesting is that there does need to be better coordination between industrial investment and local need. And I certainly wouldn't subscribe to the idea that you need to send industries to areas which are ill-suited for them.
Yeah, and another one, employers will be saying after, because there's plenty of people with practical degrees from universities, applied sciences and engineering, do every bit of badly in the job market and do history and English. Because history and English, you've got the opportunity to teach it. But if you can't get a job with a practical skill, there's some employers, you look at these student agents, some of the better educated than themselves, partly out of million attempts, and partly because they fear they might have to pay them properly.
Yeah, there is a huge issue with graduates underemployment. I don't have the exact figures at my fingertips, but I've seen estimates that up to 30% of graduates at British universities are doing jobs which don't require a degree, which does suggest some kind of misallocation of resources.
Any other questions? Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating talk. I think it brings out the strangeness of a situation that I think many people take as normal, especially young people. It's important that they understand that there could have been another way and that there could be another way. I wonder, I've got a recommendation for a TV show. I don't know if you've ever seen This Country. the BBC comedy set in a rural dead-end town in the Cotswolds, and the situation that you've described is very much the backdrop to that TV show as well. I've got like these two kids in this dead-end town. It's well worth watching to look at what this really looks like for towns like that. I do have a question. The de-skilling that was sort of an inherent part of the Industrial Revolution that was done as much really to break the power of the guilds and their apprenticeship system as it was to increase productivity, was met back then with resistance, you know, Luddism and other movements like that. So that's another important indication that this wasn't always accepted as the only way things could be. Attempts to address this, as you've described just now, have been a series of failures. But one thing that I hadn't heard of before was the T levels. I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about what exactly they are and what are the issues in implementing those.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to, Peter. Just a quick remark on what you mentioned earlier about young people in dead-end communities. I think it's hard to talk about this really without a sense of the huge tragedy of wasted opportunities for young people. Bear in mind, as I said, that more young people don't want to go to universities than actually do. And me and colleagues at King's have done quite a bit of work on the kind of situation in which young people like that find themselves. They find all kinds of barriers. Very poor careers advice is one, because the schools tend to be geared up to sending people to university. There are the transportation difficulties I mentioned. There is also the sheer complexity of our VET system. Everyone understands how to get to university. You get your A levels and off you go. The VET system is incredibly complex, and what is more, it changes all the time. Governments tinker with it. Peter's just mentioned T levels. That's yet another new kid qualification on the block, which people have got to understand, which isn't easy, and a lot of the schools don't understand it. They can't advise pupils properly. And of course, the lack of opportunities. What we found is that your family connections, your social capital, if you like, is absolutely critical in getting a successful trajectory into vocational education and the workplace. If you're part of an extended family that has a business, for example, or you've got a parent or an uncle or an aunt who've been around the block a bit and understand the education system and say one of the industries like engineering, then you get good quality advice. You'll be prepped on how to go to interviews and so on, and you're much likely to do better than someone who lacks those opportunities. So it's much more of a lottery for young people who are not following the university route, and that's, I mean, as a kind of waste of a national resource of our young people, it should appall everyone, I think. So I wanted to get that off my chest, but to go to the question about the T level, the background here is that for many years, British governments and some sections of industry have argued that we don't have adequate higher level technical qualifications, which are not narrowly job focused, but which have a broader sectoral relevance. And the Sainsbury review of 2016 recommended something like 12 to 20 or so qualifications based around sectors like healthcare, education, construction, engineering, and so on, which would serve as an entry for people who had aspirations within the field. A T level is a very chunky qualification. It's equivalent to 3 A levels. So you can see the element of risk in taking on a T level. Effectively, you've got to throw the A levels out of the window and focus on the T level. Remember, a new and untried qualification. Big attraction of it, and something that has been a pull for young people, is the 45-day work experience which is incorporated into it. That is quite innovatory. It makes it a bit more like an apprenticeship because a young person doing a T-level can get some real hands-on experience in the workplace. But as I said earlier on, this has been proven to be enormously difficult to actually secure. And I think the government has to bear some responsibility for this because they haven't sufficiently recognised the burden on employers and the risk of taking young people into the workplace. I don't think there's sufficient incentive there and encouragement. There's the risk factors, the insurance, you have a pastoral role. There are all kinds of things that you need to take account of, having a young, inexperienced person in your workplace. But if it had been handled properly, that could have been overcome, I think. But the other major difficulty was the one that I mentioned about English and Maths. Because they're quite high-level technical qualifications, they do require good achievements in Maths and English. And a lot of young people haven't yet got to that point. There have been introduced transition programs to help people get to that level, but the fact is that too few people still don't manage to get there. They have to do a GCSE in English and Maths to reach the right standard, and an argument can be made out for reconfiguring Maths and English qualifications so that they are more workplace related. It's not that these young people are inherently incompetent in reaching a good standard of Maths and English, but they probably need the incentive of having the Maths and English put in the context of the workplace to make it to motivate them better. So I think the T levels at the moment are kind of teetering between becoming something that will become established and fading away like so many innovations. I think at the moment the jury is out. But they're the kind of qualification that we do need more of, together with much improved apprenticeships, and as I suggested, the investments that we need in our further education system, which for the foreseeable future is going to provide the backbone of our VET.
You said at the beginning, sorry, that I was just thinking about your questions here, and you said at the beginning that this no-skill equilibrium is like a vicious circle, which is quite a terrifying prospect, really, because it does then ask the question, where do you begin? You know, would you say it's as much a case of having that we need to cultivate industry again in Britain before we can provide these kind of opportunities, given the sort of deindustrialisation that's happened really since Thatcher onwards?
Yes, we probably do, but it can't be the industries that we used to have, I don't think. The only other example I can think of is the People's Republic of China, which has undergone a rapid industrialization program, but one involving cutting-edge technology, which has involved the private sector very heavily, but also a directed investment from the state. So we need to think more clearly about what we're trying to do here, and identify those areas which we want to develop, which won't anymore be coal mines or engineering factories.
I think engineering factories are price. I agree with you, coal gone, and the industry's directly dependent on them.
Yeah.
Engineering is historically very high tech, or should be.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't disagree with that at all.
Any other questions? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for our student chamberlain.